Yes, good afternoon. Do you hear me well?
Yeah, we can hear you well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you for this wonderful initiative. I really sorry that I wasn't able to follow the beginning of the roundtable for other meetings we had here in the European Parliament. I'm going to say a couple of things about the very fascinating topic that has been put in front of us. Not really my capacity of head of unit for Asia Pacific in the European Parliament, but rather in an institutional way. Also, on the basis of my former experience as member of Parliament, and the draft person for the safeguard clause of the free trade agreement between the European Union and India. The provocation that is in the time, I think it is a bit like a sort of provocation. I mean, how would be, to which extent it would be helpful to have a EU embassy, an Indian embassy just for the European Union here in Brussels. I mean, it certainly would be a very good move, a very welcome move. A dedicated structure will be extremely useful. Nevertheless, that's not really the point. The point is not to have different structures, but to try to fill the gap that currently still exists between the European Union and India on a number of different areas on which we are trying to meet each other. I will briefly focus on three aspects: the economic and trade aspects, the political ground, and the relationship in a way between our society. What I see from my perspective, also compared to other countries in the region, I mean, in this huge, vast region, so being the Indo-Pacific, is a number of question mark, because on one side we do have a lot of growth between the European Union and India trade. Data are extremely relevant, and I have to say are definitely encouraging, but there is also what I could maybe define a sort of asymmetry. Something which doesn't really give a consistent approach from both sides. For instance, for India, the EU is the third largest trading partner. We know that, basically with kind of amount in terms of share, which is very similar to the one of China and the one of the United States. And when we had the United Kingdom in our ranks, we were the first trade partner with India, but we're still extremely relevant even after Brexit. On the other side, India is only the 10th largest trading partner, and if we account for about 11% of India trade, India accounts for less than 2% of the EU trade. So there is some kind of unbalance there. I mean, numbers are definitely increasing, and they're increasing quite quickly, but the potential of the two sides relationships have not yet been exploited. Even more surprisingly somehow is the fact that most of our trade is concentrated in 5 EU member states: Germany, Belgium, France, Netherlands, Italy. Those 5 EU member states, they count for something like 70% of the overall exchange between India and the EU. What about the other 22 EU member states? Among them, there are very relevant manufacturing countries and very relevant purchasers countries, such as Spain, Poland, the Scandinavian countries, and so on. It looks that the relationship has been established by a limited number of actors in some of our member states, but that the peoples-to-peoples connections, the kind of connectivity between different business actors really needs to be spread over the entire, in a much better way, the entire territory of the EU. Equally, I would say it is very important to see that the EU share in foreign investment inflows to India has doubled in just 10 years, from 8 to 18%. And now we are probably the EU, the first foreign investor in India, with direct investment, which is certainly, I mean, there, and I have a lot of figures which are very, very interesting. Nevertheless, the EU is still investing far more in China, or even in Brazil itself, which is certainly a smaller country than India. I mean, we invest something like 200 billions in China, 200 billions euro, more than 300 billions in Brazil, but after all, just 75 billions in India. So it is quite clear that a lot of work still is there to be done between India and the EU. WTO provisions are still the main rules that we do apply to regulate our economic and trade cooperations. But we are still lacking a bilateral treaty in order to put in a much more comprehensive way the cooperation and the ground to establish our common trade. We do know that between 2007 and 2013, there has been an attempt to reach a free trade agreement between the EU and India. At that time, I was member of parliament. I did follow very closely the negotiations because, as I told you, I was one of the draft person on behalf of the parliament for this agreement, which, I mean, didn't go anywhere. The negotiations were quite frustrating and overall unsuccessful. Now negotiations have been resumed. Probably this is also because of the Modi government is understanding how important would be to reduce Indian dependence on Chinese manufactured inputs, and also the kind of high quality products that the European Union can purchase from India and at the same time exchange with India. So now we have a new negotiation, which are I mean, since a couple of years, but I mean, still, I mean, there is a lot of work to do. Let me say that the full picture in the region is that we do have an already implemented free trade agreement with South Korea, with Vietnam, with Singapore, with Japan. We have concluded negotiations with New Zealand. We are very close to conclude the negotiations with Australia. We started now negotiations, and I think they're going very quickly in the right directions with the ASEAN countries and also within Indonesia. So, I mean, things are moving around. And they should move quickly also between the EU and India, indeed. What we do have in terms of issues in those negotiations, well, the aim is to have trade and goods to be liberalized behind the 94% within 7 years from the entry of the free trade agreements. We should eliminate export duties and also measures which are equivalent effect and produce new ones. The agreements should also include specific rules of origin, provisions on customs, trade facilitations. I mean, a number of provisions that again are already in place with other partners in the region. Compared to the previous attempt of negotiation, now we also have a new chapter on digital trade, which is welcomed by both India and the EU. And also new provisions for liberalizing investment provisions both at the federal and the sub-federal level. One key issue for the EU is the sustainable development chapter, which is always a matter of complicated negotiations and talks with all partners, but I mean, with Vietnam or South Korea, but this is also true for South America partners, etc. We always manage to find an agreement. It is important for us to implement relevant ILO conventions. We still have issues about India on its commitment on a number of them. India so far has ratified 6 of 8 what we consider core convention on forced labor conventions, on equal remuneration, on employment occupation, on minimum age convention, on worse forms of child labor, etc. But for the time being, there is still resistance from the Indian side to ratify conventions on freedom of associations and on right to organize and collective bargaining, which is also something that we demand for the sake of reciprocity to our partners, but not just for the sake of reciprocity, also because trade is not a goal per se. Trade is not the increasing of trade is not the aim per se. Trade is the instruments to make our society more wealthy, more just, more progressive, and closer also in a way of stability. There are a lot of other issues concerning intellectual property, geographical indication, but I would say that the development chapter has always been the one a bit more delicate in our relationship. And now this is also combined much more now than in the first negotiations with the climate targets, cut of emissions, and how a bilateral overall regulations in trade should support both India and EU efforts in reaching the targets in cutting emissions with different deadlines for the two sides, but those deadlines still should be very much connected with the provisions of the trade agreement. So a long way to go, but And here I come to very briefly to the second point. Trade, economic cooperation is certainly very much supported when there is also a political agreement, political partnership. The most extraordinary case, in my opinion, it's with South Korea and notably, I would say, with Japan. We managed to have a very ambitious, far-reaching free trade agreement with Japan, but that was somehow parallelly negotiated and then implemented with an SPA, strategic partnership agreement with Japan, which opens a huge degree of political cooperation between the two sides. I can tell you that when we were used to visit Japan, maybe 10, 15 years ago, the discussion with our Japanese partner were mostly on duties, cars, automotive industry, research, innovation, that kind of absolutely relevant field, but not much else. Now, since the entry into force of the strategic partnership agreement, we discuss about climate, we discuss about defense, security, multilateralism, coordination in United Nations, and so on. How to have a consistent approach on regional crises, maritime freedom, and other, let's say, more political issues. And this has unavoidably also direct consequences in increasing trade and economic relationship. India and the EU, from my perspective, have very friendly relationship, and actually there is not really any issue which is fundamentally dividing between the two sides. Nevertheless, there is still some resistance, in spite of having a strategic partnership status, for really trying to improve the political cooperation between the two sides. Then what happens is that at a certain moment in history, crises arise and we have to take side. And what's happening, of course, with what we consider a major violation by Russia Federation of the UN Charter in attacking Ukraine, is something that is calling the different member states in the international community to take up their own responsibility. And contrary to other like-minded countries, such as Japan, South Korea, and so on, we see from India an extremely prudent approach to the issue. Of course, we are perfectly aware how much India relies almost for 60% about its armament and military equipment from Russia. What has been the very strong relationship in political terms since the non-alignment movements with Russia, although Russia, of course, was not a non-aligned country, but I mean, there has been a very friendly relationship. I can tell you that the EU has been very much depending on interconnections in trade and notably on energy, but not just energy with Russia. And we had wonderful and very friendly relationship still now with the Russian society. But at a certain moment, it's important to take side and to spell things as far as possible with a common language. This is something which is still not there, not completely there between India and the European Union. And again, when I compare to the boosting of relationship, economic relation with South Korea, Australia, or Japan, I can see that this is something that cannot be entirely disassociated, disconnected from trade and economic partnership, because it has a direct beneficial impact on that. Last point, it is what I consider the most optimistic point. which is the relationship at large between India and the European Union. I mean, Europeans like India. Europeans love Indians. Europeans, to some extent, they pretend in our naivety to know India because of the stronger influence of Indian culture, of Indian spirituality, of Indian food, on Indian culture, of Indian art, of Indian heroes in your amazing civilization on Europe. Again, as I told you, I'm in charge of relationship for Asia Pacific in the European Parliament. There is no other Asian countries that has a good reputation, a glamour reputation, such a positive consideration in the EU public opinion than India, far more than all other partners. And if with other partners there is indeed sometimes also some kind of superficial stigma, prejudice, etc., that doesn't really apply ever, I mean, to India. There is a very, very positive, wonderful ground for getting together between the two societies. Other part of Asia are less known, less frequented by Europeans, or again, they might have still some kind of superficial prejudice, but that's not the case for India. I'm not saying anything how Europe is perceived in India. It's not up to me. But as also the wonderful job that has been carried out by Sujit Nair and by all your team, also making the new generation at work on fostering the relationship between the two sides, always proved how rich can be this kind of cooperation. Unfortunately, politicians, legislators have not yet filled this gap in the equal way as the potential between the two sides actually would allow. It is probably the duty of the next generation to fill this gap, so to have a structural and legal regulated relationship, both at the political level and economic trade level, so that India and the European Union can really be not only close friends, we're already there, but partners in changing for the good our planet, and definitely needs good willing from both sides. And that's up to us, entirely up to us. Thank you so much.